Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we go after shame any flipping way we can get at it. That's my main goal as a therapist and an educator. I am super excited for our topic today, but before we get into it, I want to just give folks a bit of an update of some upcoming events. So I am teaching on the monthly at the sanctuary around ethical non-monogamy themes. If you're interested in that, you can definitely get in touch with me. We have some upcoming presentations I'll be giving at Sunstone Symposium, which is coming at the end of July. For those who want to attend that, I'll be talking about the new guidelines of missionaries, especially female missionaries, the age level going down and the implications and impact of that, especially with the LDS prophet's statement that he's hoping that this will lead to younger marriages. We'll also be presenting the typical Ask a Sex Therapist panel, which is pretty popular. And we'll also, I'll be presenting with Julie Azevedo about our involvement in documentaries that had to do with the whole Jody Hildebrandt debacle that happened here in the state of Utah. So I'm excited about that. The Mormon Mental Health Association will also be presenting its annual conference during that same time. And I've been invited back to the fantasy cruise that is happening in February of 2027 now for, again, being an educator and a support person on a cruise that is for adults only and lifestyle oriented. So if you're interested in any of my events or anything like that, please go to natashahelfer.com. I also have my group practice at simcounseling.com, where we offer services for individuals, families, and couples. And we also offer ketamine services, especially around the themes of religious trauma. So a little bit about things that are happening in my world. But without any further ado, I want to welcome my guest today, who is Nancy Ross and Larissa Kindred. And they recently published this book along with another colleague, Jessica Finnigan, called Mormon Garments. And I am fascinated. I'm so excited for this interview. So I'll give a little bit of a bio for both. So Nancy Ross is an associate professor in the department and the department chair of the Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences Department at Utah Tech University, where she has taught for 20 years. She researches LDS and Community of Christ women, women's ordination movements, and issues related to Mormon feminism. Her book, co-authored with Jessica Finnigan and Larissa Kanno Kindred, is titled Mormon Garments, Sacred and Secret, and was published by the University of Illinois Press in February 2026. This book examines the meaning and lived experiences of those who wear garments through the lens of gender and belief. And then we have Larissa Kanno Kindred. I hope I'm saying that right, Larissa. And she holds a master's degree in mental health counseling from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and is currently a doctoral student in counseling psychology at Tennessee State University. Her clinical and research interests center on identity development, racial socialization, and the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and religion. She works as a mental health therapist and has published research on neurodiverse-affirming approaches to couples counseling and the online tradwife movement. Larissa also writes at the intersection of religion, embodiment, and lived experience, and she's the co-author of this book as well. So welcome to the show. I am so excited to have you both with me today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, we are very excited to have this conversation.
Okay, so let's start with just a brief,
Mhm.
like a brief, whatever you're comfortable sharing that's more personal as to how you come to be interested in a book like Mormon Garments, right? So maybe that's your own experience in LDS Mormon culture. I'm assuming you both come from that tradition, but you know what they say about assuming. So give us a little bit of your own personal histories and why this comes to be an area of focus and interest for you both.
I'll jump in. Years ago, the I was participating in the more and still participate in Mormon feminism, and in those spaces of like the early days, like the good days of Facebook groups, if there were, the golden age of Facebook groups. I remember that when in some of those conversations people would ask about garments, those conversations in online spaces would run into hundreds of comments, and I felt like I was learning so many things that were really unexpected. And I had a sense that, like, I didn't like my garments, and I was very much a garment wearer, but I couldn't really. I knew that it was more than they were physically uncomfortable, and I really couldn't articulate, like, the whole picture of discomfort that I was experiencing. And so, like any nerdy person, I'm like, okay, well, we'll make this a research project, right? Like, and we'll do a survey. And Jessica and I were very good friends at the time and had done some research together. And so we agreed, like, yes, weren't aware of anyone who had done this kind of work before, like big survey work with garments. And we were like, we're going to do a survey. We're going to try and get 500 participants. That would be amazing. We'll write a paper and then we'll like move on with the rest of our lives. Like that was like the goal. And then of course we did the survey. We got 4,500 responses in 1 week. It was just mind blowing.
4,000?
4,500.
Yeah, in 1 week.
In 1 week. We had been planning to, like, we were hoping to get like 500 in a month. Like that was like our, like, if we get this is amazing. But what we realized very quickly was that we did not have the resources to analyze all of the data that we had. Usually in a survey, nobody writes in the box. And people in this survey really like poured their hearts out. They like were like sharing their like deep dark garment secrets effectively. And our questions were pretty like neutral, like what do garments how make you feel, like, or what do you feel when you're wearing garments, pretty neutral things. Were producing these big lengthy detailed responses, overwhelmingly detailing like devastating experiences that I think we got the sense very quickly that people had not shared with other people, that there hadn't been like safe spaces to share. And that was in 2014. So it's taken a minute. But that's kind of how and then along the way I stopped wearing garments and leave the church, as you do. But I'll tag Larissa.
So yeah, I mean, so I was raised in the church and was a garment wearer for a little while. So I come from my bachelor's is in women's and gender studies. So I'm just always generally interested in like systems of oppression and things like that. And I was in a class where we were actually talking about Islamophobia. And we read a journal article that was actually looking at different ways that Muslim women kind of like relate to hijab and how they negotiate gender with that practice. It was so interesting to me. And there were so many similarities between like from what, the nuance to it, like this practice is like so special and sacred to them, but also like there's some difficulties with it. There's also protective factors that came from that. And so it just was really interesting. I just saw so many parallels to the experience. And then around that same time is when Mahsa Amini, who's the woman in Iran that was murdered in police custody, that kind of ignited these like protests there. And so killed during that time. And so the country like goes into like this major like protest thing. And I just kept thinking to myself, like, this is so the way that women engage in religion and with their clothing is such a relevant topic. And I was like, where are LDS women? Like, they have so much to say on this. And when I was in the church, like there was so much conversation that happened amongst women. And I was like, where are they? Like, where are they in the literature? Where are they, like, where are they in this like global conversation about how women relate? to their religious clothing. And so through that, I decided to do like a research project. And so mine was similar, but a little bit different. And I actually I feel like Nancy and Jessica's work was really pioneering and foundational because it's hard to find research that's been done specifically on LDS women. And so like I was citing them. I just was like so happy when I found their work. And so I did a survey, and mine was actually, since I'm mental health and psychology, mine was actually looking at the impact on body image and sexuality of garments. And mine kind of had the same like trajectory is that, so mine ran for 2 weeks and I had over 8,000 responses. So, and I think like what Nancy is saying and the response that like we both had in our research is that there's not a lot of, public forum there's not a good public forum for women to really talk about what their experiences are with garments because of a lot of the like the like this is sacred and don't talk about it, like the narrative around it. And so there was just like so many responses, and then every comment like are do you have other comments, every comment box was just filled. So I think I have like over 3,000 additional comments, and it's like people were really sharing a lot. And so I think that really speaks to like that women really like have an experience that needs to be shared, and there hasn't been a place to share it. Anyway, and so yeah, so I wrote something up, and then I was invited to speak at Sunstone, and then that's where Nancy and I met. So they'd kind of been like sitting on the project for a little bit, and I was kind of like somebody who was newly getting interested in kind of like the research around this topic. And so yeah, so we connected after I spoke at Sunstone, and then we were like, let's drive this thing home. And then we wrote a book with Jessica. So we did our thing.
I love this. I love this story. Now, was the research that you were doing, Larissa, female focused only? And Nancy, your research it didn't matter the gender. Is that my understanding?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's, for the sake of the audience that, I think many people who follow me probably do come from some type of LDS understanding or background, but can we give just like a few minutes of just explanation of the history and the significance of the Mormon garment? And there were some things in your book that kind of surprised me, like the progressiveness of the garment at the time, historically, right? Like it's so interesting when you see some of these, although, there's a lot of issues with the way that Mormonism was founded. There were some aspects that were pretty like progressive for the time.
Avant-garde, yeah.
Yeah, avant-garde's a good way to put it. Like that's definitely true. So I will jump in here. The history, and this is a topic I continue to write about in my own work. So Joseph Smith, probably in the late 1830s, early 1840s, he's kind of creating his temple ceremonies that become the LDS temple ceremonies that, I live in St. George, Utah. We've now got 2 temples locally, and these are the ceremonies that happen in or early versions of these temple ceremonies are what he's creating in the 1830s and 40s. And he, of course, he has these foundational visions earlier in his life where an angel visits him, and that's kind of what begins to kick things off. And at this time, he's writing in his sermons a lot about, he's using a lot of metaphors where like a kind of metaphorical garment is like, that represents the state of one's soul. And that can be like clean or dirty or white or, whatever. Using, cleanliness and whiteness as metaphors for purity and for spiritual purity. And then I am not I used to be a believer. I'm not a believer in the way that I was previously. And I think he gets the idea that, he really wants some like divine angel clothing. And that's what he's saying, that he goes to a seamstress and he's like, I saw an angel who visited me wear clothing that looks like this. Help me cut these out. That's probably our best, most likely account of what actually happened. And he doesn't like the way that the seamstress cuts them out. Right, like, and this is 100% like a man telling a woman how to like do her job in a thing that he is not at all expert in. And so he doesn't like how she cuts it out. So she has, and this is a time in which cloth is like super expensive. So he has her cut it out like 3 different times, according to whatever he imagines the angel was wearing in his vision. And then they're sewn up with red thread. Red thread is really popular at the time as a color, like an early color fast thread. And these become the first garments. And the people, very initially, the first people who wear garments are people who have, I mean, there are no who have participated in like the early endowment ceremony. And of course, we want to understand the people who participated in these very early versions of the ceremony were really polygamous. These are polygamous unions. And so I argue that garments are initially a sign of the practicing of polygamy. And so this practice kind of changes a little bit, or there's a lack of clarity because, of course, people are not writing in their early Mormon diaries a lot about how they're relating to their underwear and how they're practicing wearing garments. After Joseph Smith's murder, Brigham Young is pretty insistent that people need to wear their garments all the time. And it's not clear that that was the norm or the expectation prior to Joseph Smith's death, but after Joseph Smith's death, it becomes this really important protective factor. And so there are a lot of garments relate to a lot of different things. They hold a lot of different meanings. And of course, there is the sense that they originate with the clothing that Joseph Smith recalls angelic visitors wearing, but they also come to be symbolic of the clothing that God gives Adam and Eve before he boots them out of the Garden of Eden, which is a part, in that creation narrative is a part of Genesis, but also a part of the endowment ceremony. And then they come to mean a lot of different things. More recently, they have taken on the meaning of the atonement. That's actually not only in the last few years, but they are also symbolic of obedience. They become symbolic of the kind of law of obedience covenant in the temple. And so, but they just kind of keep accruing meaning. And of course, so they are, initially they are single piece, like long john style underwear before long john style underwear is really worn widely. And they have some Masonic symbols and other symbols on them, and they are worn beneath people's clothing. So they are religious clothing that is underwear functionally.
Right. And currently in the mainstream Latter-day Saint tradition, you receive these garments through the first kind of temple endowment ceremony. It's one of the ceremonies that LDS folks go through.
Yeah, and usually for most people, that's going to be when they're a young adult. So either pretty, soon before one might expect to get married in the temple, or before going on a mission. And so these are really, you are engaging in these temple ceremonies for the first time, and then wearing garments typically in young adult years. And so I think that that's an important kind of component of all this too.
Yeah, and just to share a little bit of my own personal experience with garments, because I too, was a member of the church, and I actually decided to take off my garment while I was still very much a believing, active member of the church. When I found out, I'd listened to a big long podcast about the garments being symbolic of polygamy, and recognizing that without consent, I was participating in a polygamous marriage ordinance when I was not aware of that. And so for me, it's interesting because I don't have the same stories that a lot of women have, especially this comfort of wearing the garment. I didn't mind the garment as much, but to me, that was such a deep betrayal that I had not understood the symbolism of it, that I did not understand that the everlasting covenant that I was entering into with my husband at the time was a polygamous ceremony. Even though I had asked many times of my leaders about polygamy, and everybody just kind of poo-poos it, or we don't practice that anymore. That was the whole thing. I'm like, no, it's very much still in practice when you have the prophet of the church at the time, basically speaking about his second wife in the here and after. And that's not something that I would be able to experience as a female, is to be more than one man. in the heavens. So for me, that was a huge betrayal, and I
Mm-hmm.
actually took off my garment as a believing active member. So that's my little story, just to.
Yeah,
No, thank you for sharing.
that's really interesting.
Yeah, I just now like attract everybody's garment stories. Like strangers tell me what they experience with their garments, and I'm just trying to roll with it. So I really appreciate you
Yeah,
sharing.
I love it all.
I'm reminded that in our survey, we actually had one woman who shared that every time she tried to put them on, if she was in some way reminded of the garment's connection with polygamy, she would give herself permission to not wear them that day. Like if this, like if she was experiencing that tension as she was putting them on because of polygamy, then she was just gonna like let it go for the day. And that really surprised me. So I think, our experiences are both our own, but they're also, as we've learned, very common. And so, I think there's definitely a group of women who are like, I don't want to wear garments because of polygamy, or this knowing that they're about polygamy creates this tension.
Yes, right. Yeah. Larissa, do you have any thoughts about either the history or anything you feel like we're missing as far as the kind of meaning that people give the garment today?
I think one of the things that's like so fascinating about the meaning of garments is that garments have taken on different meanings, and you can really track through garments kind of like what the main like priority or task of the church was at the time, because they're used in like in different ways. And so, like there was narratives around garments that were like, this is to separate us from the world, or, like we're being a peculiar people, and so we're doing this. In the 80s and 90s, that was peak purity culture. So it was all about modesty at that time. And now the church is really in this process of wanting to be seen as mainstream, like part of mainstream Christianity. And so now we're seeing this language, like Nancy says, that's very new, that says, oh, these actually symbolize the atonement, or the veil of the temple, which is like, that's 100% new. And so when they said this in conference, like somebody was like sending me the clip, and I was like, we're watching this happen right now. This is a thing. And I think one thing that's so fascinating is that different people latch on to these different meanings, and people believe they have different meanings. So there's not a cohesive meaning for garments in the church. There's certain things, like people will say like, it's a reminder of my covenants. Like it's a day, it's an outward symbol of an inward commitment, or like they kind of have these sayings. But in the qualitative data that from both of our surveys, you will have people that still strongly believe that they are a physical protection. Like I was going to, like be this happened, and then it didn't. There's people that strongly believe that they are still a symbol of modesty, and that they need to remind us to cover our bodies. There are still, so these things are still there. And it's interesting because you'll read one comment that says, like, these are not about modesty. These are never about modesty. They're about a reminder of your covenants. And then you'll flip to the next one, and they'll be like, these are about modesty, and modesty is so important to us as Latter-day Saints. And so it's like, so they hold so much meaning. And there is usually a narrative, like a common narrative that's happening during certain periods around what garments are. But because that narrative has shifted over time, so many times, all of these narratives still kind of like float around garments. And so they take on a different meanings to different people, kind of depending on what they relate to, or even like what era they started wearing garments in. And so it's just like the meaning of garments is just so, it's like there's so they have so many meanings, I guess is what I'm saying.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, and part of that, unfortunately, oftentimes shows up as moral superiority. Like my meaning is the real meaning. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, yes.
Because I heard President Kimball, or I heard President Benson, or
Mhm.
so it really is interesting how these different meanings can create quite a bit of division even within the in group about what things mean and what they should mean, and how people
Mhm.
wear them and
Yes.
wear them and all those. Yeah. And it's definitely a marker too for inclusion in the group, right? It's a way,
Absolutely.
yeah, can you talk a little bit about how garments are a form of group monitoring?
Yeah. And that is so much about what our book is about. Just this, how we have this community practice of surveillance. And we know so if underwear is supposed to be hidden, we also understand and how to recognize those lines, right? Those garment lines at mid-thigh and, different lines at the shoulders and at the neck. And, it becomes a community reflex to check to see if people are wearing their garments. And so this is something, when I'm explaining garments to people who have never been part of the Mormon community, it's like, this isn't secret. Like, your underwear is like actually visible to everybody in the room, right? Like, it's everybody knows. And this checking to see if people are worthy, right? Like, is this wearing garments is like a shorthand way of declaring yourself, a worthy temple member and, conforming to all the church things the church is asking you to do in your life. And that shorthand is very meaningful, because then when people take them off, or if people take them off, or if they need to modify the wearing of their garments for any reason, these things are difficult because they are so laden with social meaning.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many times I heard, especially men I've worked with, oh yeah, when I was dating, like the ladies would like kind of like rub my arm or let my leg, and I could tell they were checking to see if I was wearing the garment.
Yeah.
It's funny because I think there's like something like they say in the church that's like the reason their underwear is because it's personal. It's between you and like the Savior. But garments are not personal. Like, not within the church. Like, they're not personal. They're everybody's business. And we all know how to like that shirt doesn't look like you would wear garments with that, or and so like there's nothing personal about it within the in-group. It's very much it's community business.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. And then, yes. And just to also clarify for people who are listening, not all members of the church go to the temple. Going to the temple is different than going to church. Anybody can go to church, including non-members. Go to the temple, you need to have like a higher level of behavioral standards that you're willing to meet, including things like paying tithing and making sure that you're having certain belief systems in check, and also certain behavioral things like not drinking coffee or not drinking alcohol, sexual behavior, of course, not looking at pornography. Although we know that, of course, tons of people are going to the temple with all of these behaviors not necessarily in check anyway, but that's the idea, right? So it's already a system where if you haven't gone to the temple, but you're a member of the church, you're already kind of like a subpar citizen of the group, and you're not going to have as many opportunities to worship or to participate in the kind of normal milieu that those who do have the temple recommend and who are wearing the garment.
Yes.
So it is really kind of almost like a caste system of sorts.
Very much so. Very much so.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to really move into some language that I loved in your book. I mean, you talked about the power over Mormon bodies. That was like a quote. And there was another one that you talked, religious technology to restrain sexual behavior. I was like, I want that sentence just, I don't know, plastered. I love that. Religious technology to restrain sexual behavior. Of course, most folks who do wear the garment, who would consider themselves LDS, would say that's not what this is about. So how is it that, so this is where I want to start diving in. Like, tell me more about why you see this as power over a body.
So, and of course the full explanation is in the book, and there are a lot of pieces to answering this question. I would say that that garments and the way that garments function for individuals and their own bodies, and also within the community, as we were just talking about, are about signaling status in the community, but also then about disciplining the body in ways that are appropriate that prioritize the needs of the institution for your body. right? Like it's, right, if the institution says I'm not supposed to drink coffee or like have premarital sex or right, like all these things, I have disciplined my body to the extent to which I have accepted those and I'm trying to implement that. And wearing the garment is like the symbol of that thing, right? Like that connection to that law of obedience covenant where, I promised that I would, do the things the church is going to say. And so, right, there's a sense then that in that covenant, that in that practice, that in that community surveillance, and in the formal surveillance of like temple recommend interviews, there's a lot of concern about what bodies are doing, right? Like there's a belief element. What do we believe? But and we also in Mormonism describe belief in terms of our feelings, right? If we have a good feeling about something, that's belief. That's like the evidence of belief is a good feeling is the evidence of belief. But then as to whether or not we've like disciplined our bodies in the appropriate way, and then the visible evidence of that, that discipline, that obedience, that control is the wearing of the garment. And so and then we have all of this language then in the church and a lot of teachings about what bodies are supposed to be doing and not doing. And now looking back on my Mormon experience, I left about 10-ish years ago. And I think about how much institutional anxiety I received about my sexual desire, about sexual behavior. And throughout my whole life, I received these very strong messages and received a lot of fear mongering messages, right? And what happens is that I feel like my garments so absorb all that meaning around what bodies are supposed to do. And so when I was wearing the garment, it was like I was agreeing that I was going to be meeting those requirements to discipline my body in the ways that the church had instructed. And there's so much anxiety in church history, in church teaching around sex and sexual behavior, right? Polygamy in the 19th century creates so much difficulty for the church. It creates legal difficulty. We kind of go to the war with the federal government over, these things Congress is enacting. Numerous anti-polygamy pieces of legislation in the popular press. Polygamy is equated, it becomes racialized, and Mormons are described as having darker skin, like Muslims are described at the same time, right? So there's a racialization that happens. In the 19th century, as the church is trying to figure out its distinctive practices, but in the 20th century, the church is we just want to be like everybody else, right? We just want to be able to blend. We want to be able to blend, and we want to fit into the mainstream of American society. And evangelicals have long set sexual norms in American society. And evangelical teaching throughout the 20th century kind of emphasized not only women's sexual purity, but also men's sexual purity, and kind of figured that if you created women as sexless, if you spiritually formed women as sexless, and gave them the power to gatekeep men's sexual behavior, then you would create pure men because the women would be denying them, right? Like the women are the gatekeepers. And so, I mean, I'm giving the kind of very TLDR version of this, but in order for Mormons to become white and assimilated in the 20th century, they need sexless women, and they need to figure out how to shed their oversexed image that they had received from polygamy. And they went hard in the other direction around sexual control and sexual purity. And so garments and absorbing become something that already exists in Mormonism that was a symbol of polygamy. And in the early 20th century, the church goes all in with ideas of sexual purity and then connects that to women's modesty, really begins to emphasize that mid-century, that this connection between modesty is creating something that creates and has a relationship to sexual purity. And so if we have in the late 20th century an image of Mormons as upright, normal, white Americans, and broadly fitting into the sexual norms of white America, that is something that the garment helps Mormons achieve by being able to kind of use this distinctive Mormon thing and keep changing its meaning, right? Like it becomes something to project institutional anxiety onto, and that the church over time increasingly controls. Initially, anybody can like sew garments. You get it, you get some, you like mark out your pattern, you can make garments. But then by about 1920, by 20s, 30s, only beehive clothing mills. So it used to be a lot of makers of garments, and then only the church can make garments. And then that turns into, well, if we are controlling this, then we're controlling sleeve length and leg length, and we are actually controlling what our population wears. And then we project lots of messaging into that space around bodies. And again, that's a, a quick and dirty description, but I think we have so much messaging and so much anxiety that we receive, and that goes somewhere, and I think it goes into garments, and then those garments like aren't just a thing that is worn, but they hold these ideas. And these ideas like interface with our bodies, and they interface with our private parts, right? Like, so in this very direct way. And so even then, the ways in which people experience their garments physically can end up grating on their spiritual belief, because the garment is this thing that holds belief as a constant in our lives. So anyway, so.
That's super fascinating. Are you able to, Larissa, kind of speak to the impact then, right? As a therapist yourself, like everything that Nancy is sharing, what impact then does that have? Like when you think about, this being a power over a Mormon body or a technology, right, to restrain sexual behavior. How does it start? Like, how would you put a mental health lens on that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in my research, that was kind of like the exploration was like, does this have an impact? And one thing I think is so interesting that we see is that and one thing that I did is Nancy did this in a more like finessed way. Nancy and Jessica had all of their people kind of like answer like almost like temple recommend like belief questions, and they actually created like a measure that's like a belief scale. In the one that I did, I asked people to kind of self-identify as like, would you consider yourself like, traditional or devout, nuanced, progressive? I also wanted to hear from ex-Mormons or people who were inactive. And so I kind of like asked people to self-identify because I wanted to know if there was differences. And one thing that was so interesting is that there were very devout traditional women who took the survey. And when you look at just that group of people, even they will report that it had a significant impact on their sexual, like on intimacy, like in marriage. And I mean, I think over 50%. And that's just like, if you took it the whole group, we're talking like 70, maybe like 70% of all women said it had some impact. But even if you look at just the traditional devout, they also have really, really high numbers of saying this had a negative impact on my sexuality or my intimate life. And the thing that's wild to me about this is that the church always says like, these are certain, there's times that you can comfortably take off your garments, right? And it's like, what do they say? It's like the three S's or whatever. And it's like swimming, swimming or like sports and sex. Like, is that the saying? And so like sex is an activity that we know that is okay to not wear your garment. So that's not the issue. So like, what is the issue? Like, what is the impact? And so, people kind of like,
people are not typically wearing their garments during sex behavior is what you're saying.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Orthodox LDS members are not wearing their garment, but yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. And so if you're not, it's not like a logistical issue, right? Your garments aren't like impeding sex
Mhm.
logistically. So what is happening with our garments that is actually impacting how we relate to our own sexuality or to our partner and their sexuality? And one thing that we talk about in the book is that when we compare to like evangelical purity culture in the evangelical world was very focused on adolescent girls, right? And so like you need to be doing this, and there needs to be modesty, and you can wear your purity ring, and we do purity pledges and things like that. And we see this in the language around how, like how we teach LDS female adolescents, but the practice of like wearing garments starts in marriage. And so like, like this is something that is like taken to another level, because now we're actually seeing that there's some level of like restraint, sexual restraint or body restraint or something that is happening not pre-marriage, but also within marriage. So this is where this idea of like there should actually be a controlled sexuality or some, like within marriage. It's not just like, hey,
Yeah.
it's not just about premarital sex. It's also about like managing sex or sexuality after you get married, which is different than what happens in evangelical purity culture.
Yeah, the sense of like monitoring to make sure that even when sex is sanctioned,
Hmm.
we're really talking about intercourse, right? This is all very
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
um, that we want to make sure it is holy, it is righteous, it is sacred, which all those terms, albeit they have spiritual value for some people. As a sex therapist, I have not seen those correlate very well with sexual expression, sexual,
yeah.
No.
all the things that we know are helpful for people to express their sexuality, which is more of a freedom, a surrender, even an animalistic, ability
Mhm.
to just, be in the moment of the pleasure of your body instead of thinking about the sacredness and temple.
Right.
Talk about our bodies as temples. So it's kind of like, well, temples are supposed to be pristine and pure all the time. And what about our bodies that are more, I don't know how pristine things like feces and sperm and visitation and urine are, so
Yeah.
many of these things are what's happening during a sexual encounter. So the disconnect of like idealizing the body, idealizing the purity and the virtue of a body versus the actual bodily act of having
Hmm.
intercourse.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And And I think that there's a piece here too that is also gets a little right, like in this discussion, which is just as like in the social sciences, we talk about like gender is something that is constructed. Like sexuality is also to a certain extent constructed, and in part it is constructed for women through underwear, right? Like, and the development of garments for women largely follows the trends of men's underwear. And today, I mean, I certainly saw my garments when I was a garment wearer as being like frumpy and like very outdated in their style. And that is not like a super sexy like vibe, right? Like this, we had so many men report that their wives who they felt were really attractive looked really unattractive, like sexually very unappealing in garments. And also so many women saying that garments made them feel very unattractive and then and it made it difficult. And like again, it's not that like we don't know how to take them off, or is that right? Like it's but it created these other barriers for being able to access sexual feelings. And I think that this probably happens in a couple of different ways. I think there is physical discomfort that I think a lot of women has described what was effectively dissociation. They felt their garments were physically uncomfortable, and that in order to tolerate this practice all the time, that they just learn to ignore the sensations of the body. And many, many, many women described this. And so there's that like very much embodied, I have to wear this underwear. This underwear is physically uncomfortable. I have this religious requirement. I have to do it anyway, and so there's that. And then there are these ideas that we associate with underwear. And, if it would be very difficult to go out into the wide world of buying underwear and buy underwear that looks like garments, right? Like, because these are just not, you would not associate these with sexual activity. And so I think that creates a lot of difficulty when we think about garments in the history, in like the fashion history of underwear. There are moments when garments are not so far away from like mainstream underwear, and even some early moments when they are anticipating some changes that are coming. And that's, interesting because they become imbued with so many religious ideas. It becomes very difficult to change them and and to develop these styles. And so the development of the style of garments is far behind contemporary underwear. And then it becomes very difficult for us to imagine ourselves as sexual beings when we're wearing underwear that feels very unsexy.
Yeah. Well, it always reminds me of the classic, like, even evangelicals who, purity culture, when we're thinking about healing from purity culture, a very classic thing that you hear people talk about is like, well, I was taught no, no, no. And then
Yeah.
easy to just because we had one day where we had a ceremony, then be go, 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 right? And so,
Yeah.
right, that you can't just, tell a person all this stuff,
Right.
20 years of their lives and then expect that all to just magically go away because now you're sanctioned to have sex. So
Yeah.
as an ongoing reminder. So it's like you're saying, it's not just for premarital sex. Now you have it during your marital sex. And so you have all these reminders of purity and virtue
Hmm.
and gatekeeping. And so even though you're taking it off, maybe for the behavioral act, you're still carrying all of
Yes.
messaging while you're having sex.
Yeah. And
Yeah, 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 yeah.
it's a huge turnoff, right? Like, and this is what people told us, right? Like in very direct terms, right? It is a huge turnoff. So it kind of disrupts the relationship between married couples, and it disrupts the relationship with the self. Right. And and that's a lot. That's a lot to carry.
I think one thing, like just building on this, like disrupting your relationship to yourself, is that, I mean, I think that like even people who love their garments usually are like, but they're like, these are hard to navigate, right? Like we have periods, I'm breastfeeding, I'm pregnant, I weight gain and weight loss. It's just very, very hard on like for many, many women's bodies. And I think when you have a practice like this, and also, like, I'm a neurodiverse person, and so like wearing another layer under my clothing that's a big, big ask. And I think that when you have so much importance around this practice, but then there's a lot of discomfort with wearing it, you have to learn to dissociate a little bit from your body. And so I think that, like we're asked to do these things and it's like, yeah, I don't like it, but it's so important. And suffering is sometimes sanctified,
Yeah.
like within like the Mormon tradition. And so it's like, I'm just going to do this. And you may have to disconnect from your body to be able to do this practice and do it well and to be accepted within the community. And I think that in general, if you have to disconnect a little bit from your body and your sensations and what you're really feeling, I think that you are going to have a very hard time feeling arousal or really like
Yes.
settling into like, yeah, how does this feel? Or do I like this? And like, is this okay? Because you've kind of learned to push, like be disconnected and not listen to your body. And so I think that's something that comes from, like it comes from having to tolerate something that is not comfortable,
Yeah.
like that's one of the side effects, I would guess, of this practice is that you may be less connected to your body and your sensations and your feelings.
Well, as you're talking about that, it also brings to mind that we're already asked to disconnect from our bodies by the principles against masturbation. And so,
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
right. And so you're not allowed to explore your body. You're not allowed to understand pleasure. You're already in a culture that tells you that, especially in a female body, that sexiness is dangerous, right? Because you
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
the male gaze. And so you want to be a pure woman, a righteous woman, a
Hmm.
proper woman. Again, none of that helps me feel sexy or
Right.
like,
And
I want to really get into this feeling. And it's just supposed to be ethereal and loving. And so it just sets up so many unrealistic expectations. Go ahead, Nancy.
No, I was just going to say exactly that it really sets people up for a lot of failure, like in their sexual relationship. And if so much LDS teaching also emphasizes like partnership and lifelong partnership, right? Like that sex is created as a real stumbling block, right? Like, because where church members, if they've been trying to like do these things that the church has taught them, then they may not be very well prepared to, right, experience pleasure in marriage. And as this book took a long time to write, and a lot of this was like wrestling with what people were saying in the responses, trying to figure out like how do we string this all together to make meaning of it, but also reflecting on our own experiences and really coming to terms with what we had also experienced. And, if I think for myself, what is one of the biggest challenges that I still experience over having worn garments years ago, I took them off now like more than a decade ago, it is that dissociation is just such a like, and I'm also neurodiverse and experience garments as uncomfortable, among other things. But that dissociation becomes such a reflex, and it is very hard to learn to like stay present in our physical bodies for so many reasons. And I am, and I'm sure that it didn't happen just first with garments for me, but garments probably made that a pretty constant practice.
This is at the heart of orgasm, of arousal,
Right.
passion, surrender. You can't without having a sense of presence.
Right.
I think too, like one of the things that is so painful is just to even think about, like, as you're talking about couples navigating this, and of course we're talking about heterosexual couples because that's the only type of marriage, that's seen as legitimate in the LDS faith. So is my thoughts about, again, when does sex begin and end, right?
Yeah.
Begin and end. And so if we're going with the classic patriarchal kind of male-centric experience, sex ends with the thrusting of the penis into a vagina, and it ends with the ejaculation of sperm into a vagina. What we know about female sexuality is that is not when sex begins and ends, right? Sex with the flirtations, with the arousal, the stimulation, not just of erogenous zones, but also the stimulation of the mind and the brain. And then sex ends. I always think about, I always encourage my couples to think about the afterglow, like ejaculation, which of course doesn't always mean that that's met with female orgasm either.
Right.
75% of women do not experience orgasm through like thrusting or intercourse. But even if you have both reached orgasm, the afterglow period, right, that release, that coming off of the hormonal like aspects of that are very bonding, very connective, is part of sex.
Yeah.
Taught, well, the moment somebody ejaculates, that's probably the moment you need to get up and put your garments back on.
So many people said that. So many people talked about that thing of like, I need to get these back on as soon as someone's done. Yeah.
And I tell it because anonymous surveys can be a little impersonal. We also all tell all the co-authors tell stories of their own garment wearing experience. And I tell a story of exactly this, my husband and I having sex and falling asleep naked quite accidentally, and then waking up in the middle of the night and feeling like I have committed some like grave moral sin because we did not like shut everything down to, get dressed again. And that sounds so like, right, like I remember this and I remember this feeling and how it felt like such a moral failing, And then, to come to realize that other people are describing the same feelings, the same sets of feelings and around the same things. And, it really then lends and before I first went through the temple, my bishop in England, not even the American bishop in England, was like, you know, giving me these instructions and not saying ejaculation because he wasn't going to say ejaculation, but kind of in not so many words saying, and when it is all over, you need to put them back on right away, you know, making it very clear to me what that meant without regard for other sexual needs, right? Or that, you know, and right and how that impacted then my first sexual experiences, you know, right? And that's, you know, not 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 great, and certainly not with a lot of like freedom to explore, and like with not with a sense of freedom, but rather with a sense that there is a beginning, there is a clearly defined end, and when the clearly defined end has happened, you must wrap this up and move along, you know.
Well, it ignores all the research on skin to skin contact,
Hmm.
how important that is, not just with a mother and a babe, but with partners, right? And so again, if we are saying the only time that it is worthwhile to take off this garment is for the intercourse aspect of connection, you are ignoring all the cuddling, all the non, you know, intercourse aspects of sexuality that are so potentially bonding for a pair to lie with one another, skin to skin contact, as they fall asleep, as they cuddle. If they haven't had intercourse, like why would that not be a sufficient reason, right, to necessitate the taking off of the garment?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how much joy is lost by pathologizing exactly that, right? It's not just that it's that then doing that or feeling like there's a time limit, or, you know, and again, maybe I'm only describing my own neurodivergent rule following self, but I know that I am not the only person who felt like these obligations to follow to like do things in the way that I had committed and the way that I was expected, you know.
Well, that's the other irony that's so sad, is that the more serious people take these beliefs and are more rule following and are more obedient, in my anecdotal evidence, it's the more they're suffering, right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely agree.
All the members who are like, I don't care if I wear them at night at all, you know, or they're, you know, they're just more, and they're kind of shocked that other people would take it so seriously.
Hmm.
I'm like, yeah, but you're more flexible in your system and your ability to worship and your ability to integrate this into your life. And so it's not having the same type of cost that it might be having, even though,
Exactly.
Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, one last thing. I know we're kind of starting to come up on time. One more thing I have, then I'm going to ask you both if there's something I haven't hit on. But when I'm thinking about the comments both of you made about dissociation, which really has to do a lot with both sexual pleasure, we haven't talked about body image much, so maybe we can talk about that too. But I really think about the 6 principles of sexual health, right, which are like consent, non-coercion, protection from unwanted pregnancies and STIs,
Hmm.
honesty, shared values, and mutual pleasure.
Hmm.
One that I think Latter-day Saints, observant Latter-day Saints struggle with the most, in my experience, throughout my 30-year career working with all the whole spectrum, the post-Mormons, the Mormons,
Hmm.
everybody, is honesty. Is honesty, which is so interesting, right? When honesty is such a huge principle, but because
Mhm.
of all of these messaging that are represented by the garment, you really cannot be honest about your sexuality.
No.
You have to be obedient about your
Yeah.
Mm. Mhm.
honest with yourself about what would feel good. What do I like to fantasize about? What's my
Yeah.
orientation driving me towards, right? What's my gender identity? No, it's already all prescribed for you.
Yeah.
And I have to actually ignore the honest part of my body and my eroticism and my erotic template in order to fit this box, which then is
Hmm.
represented by the garment.
Yeah.
How are you going to be honest with a partner if you can't even be freaking honest with yourself?
Yeah. Yeah.
What thoughts do you have about that?
100%. So one of the unexpected pieces of this was for me was how there are, you know, is a large group of men who are also experience significant dissatisfaction with their garments, but for perhaps different but also related reasons that women do. And one of the things that and we call them non-conforming believing men. We're trying men who experience doubt in their belief as part of their like orientation to belief. One of the things that they described is this like resistance to feelings of being controlled by the church, or feeling like they were being controlled. They felt like they should have more agency in their lives, but the church was controlling this. This just felt like wrong. And one of the things they described, though, was many of these men were married to women who didn't experience doubt. And so we describe them in our book as like conforming believing women. Their beliefs kind of conform to the model the church has set forth. And these men were often articulating that in their marriage, the garment served as a kind of like held the same symbolism as a wedding ring. And if they were to, they might communicate various or things to their spouse, but if they were to take off their garments, their spouse would understand it as setting aside the marriage. And that that therefore then they could not be honest about their belief with their spouse, or modify the way that they wore garments to maybe better suit, to create a little more flexibility in their lives and to reduce this feeling of being controlled. Because coming back to what you said, there's a certain degree of honesty that can't really happen because the garments mean too much, right? Like they are so like laden with meaning that any like deviation from the norm means so many things, including that maybe they are not wanting to honor their marriage covenant. And so like this was like maybe a thing I had not considered or encountered before. But I think it comes back to the sense of honesty that like it's often very difficult for people to talk about differences in their approach to belief within Mormonism, because there's a right belief and a wrong belief, or there's this feeling that, and there's a lot of judgment. And then we wear the symbols of such things, which are hidden, but they are very visible, right? And so it is very, very, very difficult to be honest about things like belief because there is so much moral weight and categorization. And these categories have like eternal consequences. And the more you place eternal consequences on everything, it's just, I'm sure it just feels like unnecessary risk to be talking about things like speaking honestly, right? Like because the costs are so high.
And I see that a lot of my mistakes is that if one person does lose belief and takes off the garment, this is seen oftentimes as a betrayal.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And the other person isn't saying they need to take it off. It's still seen as this communal agreement between if you take that off, then yes, it's almost like, are we not married? Are we?
Yeah.
Does this mean you want to go have sex with other people? Do you?
Yeah.
My mixed babe, my transitioner being like, how did it turn into all of this? That
Yes.
Yeah.
Anymore. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Larissa, what's coming up for you?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's other things that are elements of this. I was actually just thinking of a funny thing when we were talking about this is I stopped wearing my garments before my partner stopped wearing his garments. So I had not worn garments for a little bit. And then when he took his garments off, I actually like I had the awareness to mark it, but I had like an anxiety about it, and it almost was like he's gonna have an affair now. Like so,
Yeah.
and I had to really be like, okay, wait, I know where this is coming from, and like be realistic about it. But like that was me like post more, like it's still like that reaction still came up that I was like, ooh, this feels unstable. Like, why are you taking your garments off? Like I hadn't worn mine for like a while, and I was like, whoa, what's he doing here? He's like, anyway, so yeah, so like what we're talking about like was very real for me, and it came out even when you can intellectually like you understand that that's not a thing, but it still came out in the moment, but.
And And I think this just comes back to how we actually do, without naming it, understand garments as a religious technology for sexual restraint,
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
even if we're not describing it outwardly in that way.
Do either one of you want to just quickly talk about body image? And because when I'm thinking about body image, I'm thinking about people not struggling with enjoying their body, liking their body, how their body looks.
We have plenty of that description, especially for women, but also for men, throughout the survey. I think it's really hard and sad to read that hundreds of times. That just this sense of disconnection with the self, of feeling frumpy, that making it difficult to access sexual feelings, and then just being able to imagine yourself as the self you would like to be, or right, like there's this, like the garments are holding you back from physically and representing yourself as a more attractive, just there's the sense that they are like inherently unattractive, and that you have to like hold that intention with your sense of self all the time. And I think that is destructive.
More about not allowing us to feel attractive.
Yeah.
More. Yeah, Larissa.
Yeah, Natasha, you've probably read like, like kind of like the foundational like body image like study that was done. I think it was like Frederickson in the 90s. That's when it was like a lot of the language that we used was like first brought out like during this kind of like pivotal thing. But anyway, one thing that I feel like is so interesting that we see when we survey LDS women is that there's a lot of body surveillance. And anybody who's worked with like eating disorders or like, like significant body image issues, we know that body surveillance is the behavioral manifestation. And I bring up this like Frederickson research because they call it self-objectification. Right? Where instead of viewing my body as like, this is my vehicle that I experience life, it's more like, like, am I appropriate? Am I doing this right? And so they kind of look at it through the lens of like self-objectification, and they call body surveillance the behavioral manifestation. And I think that what we see within LDS culture is that there's a really unique brand of body surveillance where you're like, is my garment show, like, is this poking out? Like, is my garment show? Are my garment, is this thing, or like, are people thinking that I'm not wearing them because this skirt looks a little bit different or whatever? And so it's interesting that like I think all of us are prone to body surveillance, unfortunately, but I think there's like an added layer that comes from garment wearing where like you have people really, really like monitoring the way they're sitting and these different things. And I think I think that's like has a big impact on how we feel about our own bodies. And we know that body surveillance has been linked to, other issues that come from body image issues. And so I think that that's something that we see very clearly is that this monitoring and this self-surveillance is causing an issue, and garments play a huge role in that.
Yeah, that's objectification theory, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Barbara Fredrickson, really fascinating work. So yeah, I want to end with really kind of this, you stated it at the intro and then you explained it throughout your whole book, but that what your research really did is, I think what a lot of us anecdotally already knew, but you added evidence to the idea that the wearing of LDS Mormon garments does harm body image, it reduces sexual desire, and it limits sexual behavior. Those are three huge, impactful issues for people who are trying to, first of all, have healthy marriages, have healthy sex lives, enjoy sexual pleasure, because although we're critiquing a lot of the LDS doctrine right now, we do have some sex positive messaging in Mormondom where we don't just see it as procreative in nature only. There is some value put on the enjoyment of a couple being able to have sexual pleasure together, and yet we stand in its way on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
And that has real life implications, because as a sex therapist, I just want to remind everyone that this isn't just an auxiliary aspect of our lives that, well, you know, if you get to go on vacation every now and then or something. No, our sexuality is an integral part of our sexual wellness, of our health, of our mental health, of our physical health, of being able to express ourselves. And so it is really a sexual health, mental health issue. It's not just, oh, well, you know, you didn't get to have as cute as or orgasms as the other person. Like, no, this matters. This ties to our immunity, to our stress, to depression, to anxiety, to body image. I mean, these have real life implications. And it's just tragic for me when we impose things that are not necessary. I call it unnecessary tragedy. Life is hard enough without imposing unnecessary tragedy on top of it. So those are my final thoughts. What each of you, I'll give you kind of some final thoughts that you'd like to kind of leave us with. Larissa, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I would say like I feel like my approach to like looking at garments and studying like LDS women, you know, as a population, my goal is always that I like LDS women, whatever their experiences are with their garments, and some feel like the good outweighs the bad that they deal with. You know, we're looking at overall statistics on what's going on here. But with that, I feel like my general thought is that like women we know that men are impacted by garment wearing, but women are just impacted more. That just the way women's bodies are, women's fashion, like the social narratives around gender, like women are just impacted more. And I think the thing that I always want to do when we start writing books or doing research or putting out articles is that I want to have LDS women say what their experience is with garments. And so I think that's kind of like the most important element for me in this type of a work is that LDS women, their experiences matter. They're nuanced, you know, they're interesting, and you'll find so much variation, but their experiences matter, I think, more than anybody else's, because they have marginalization, because it's so distinct. So they have a lived experience that men do not have, that, you know, with as far as garment wearing goes. And so for me, it's always about like letting LDS women tell the story of what their experience is, and all the nuance that comes with it. You might be really struggling with your garments, but they also may mean something really, really important to you. And we can hold space for all of that. But the name of the game, I think, for our research is to always say this is what, like, we don't want to hear what the aspirational meaning of garments is that came from the pulpit. The real story of garments comes from LDS women and ex-Mormon women who their experiences are often discounted within the community because people will say like, oh, they left the church, don't listen to them. But people who like exit interviews are really important to know like what's going on with an institution. And so I think that like all of these voices matter. And I think that they kind of should be the ones that are like setting the stage for how we understand garments, because this is a lived experience that is very, very complex, very nuanced, and women are having a very, very distinct experience. And so I think just like my closing statement is that like this is what is important to me as a researcher, not to say like garments are good, garments are bad, you should or shouldn't do this. As a researcher, my goal is to elevate voices who have not had a platform to really, really share their lived experience, and hopefully like LDS women like decide how they want to engage with this practice. So I think that's an important thing for me to always kind of like put out, is that like this is kind of like the overarching goal of like what I do, and I know what Nancy and Jessica also do.
Yeah. Thank you, Larissa. That was very well said. Nancy, what are your final thoughts?
No, and just similarly, our whole goal in writing this book wasn't to tell people, that garments are good or garments are bad. But I would hope if there are garment wearers, and I know that there are garment wearers who are reading this book, and I would hope that they would feel a little more freedom to find more flexibility as a result of reading the book, recognizing that they can prioritize different elements of their health while finding ways to probably engage with this practice. And so I would just love it if people found the flexibility they needed to make their life work. I think that would be that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much both, but first of all, for your time, for your research, for your willingness to write this. This has, again, been an interview about Mormon Garments, Sacred and Secret by Nancy Ross, Jessica Finnigan, and Larissa Kanno Kindred. So pick it up. It's a great read. And thank you again so much for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Take care.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can also find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The information shared on this program is informational and should not be considered therapy. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality and may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade no. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. you.